Hey guys, today I have my friend Darren King. He has his own podcast. I'm really excited for him to be on the show. I had another friend kind of tell me about his podcast, and so I checked it out. I really liked it, and I thought that he could, hopefully synthesize that to the best of his ability and tell us kind of what he's into. And so I'll let Darren kind of introduce himself.
Hi, Kendall, and everyone else. So my name's Darren King. I go by the hashtag or the handle Exoacademian often, because when I first sort of started my podcast, it was kind of more anonymous, and over time I've kind of come into the fore more. Um, but my background is kind of diverse. I had, like you, part of my background was as a Christian and as evangelical. Had experiences of a spiritual nature when I was younger. Kind of went through the whole postmodern deconstruction kind of thing. In my 20s, kind of went into like the emerging church and Brian McLaren, then in that whole scene. Eventually, kind of felt like where I landed was spiritual but not religious kind of thing. Even though I know that's kind of a bit of a false, kind of division sometimes. But generally having this sense of there being kind of this numinous quality to life, that there's these a metaphysical reality that underpins and overgirds everything. And along my way, I also had encounters with with people and with beings that seem to defy normal conventions of what's possible. So there's sort of like a parallel between sort of religious history and what people call the UFO phenomenon. And over the last few years, I've really dedicated myself to understanding that sort of overarching metaphysical kind of architecture, and even looking into Jacques Vallée and work like that around his book Passport to Magonia. Could these actually be the same thing? Could they be just the same thing, kind of encountering entities that are non-conventional, but the way we categorize them over time perhaps changes, and perhaps not. Maybe there's more than one type. I kind of lean towards that. I think that when people talk about disclosure, it's much more than aliens coming from Zeta Reticuli or something in spacecraft. I think the nature of reality is really in play when we talk about disclosure. So that's kind of the broad brush of what I'm kind of into.
Yeah, that's great. So I think it goes without saying, but today on the podcast, we're here to answer the question: Are aliens real? Or first question, at least.
Yeah. So before we went on the air, you and I talked about this a little bit because, of course, the question is, what do we mean by alien, right?
Hmm.
Um, when I think back to my biblical studies background, often that term was used in a variety of ways. Sometimes it could mean the tribe that was over the hill, right? They were the other, right? They were the alien. I said once that a friend of mine actually was in a band in high school called Alien and the Psycho, and that was actually based on a translation of a scripture reference in the Old Testament, right? So all that is to say, what alien means kind of varies depending on what context you're in, right? So in modern 21st century America and Western civilization, that tends to mean space alien, right? Like someone who's come from some other star system, some other galaxy, and traveled here in a spacecraft or something. But alien, the way that I use it, is more like other, something other than conventional understanding of who we are. I have a friend, Mike Masters, who teaches in Montana, and he's developed a whole notion of some of these others that people encounter might be what he calls extraterrestrials rather than extraterrestrials, meaning that they may be us from the future. And his background is in evolutionary biology, and with a specialty in the hominid line. So when he looks at what we typically describe as a gray alien, he sees a being that looks like what we will look like in maybe 10,000 years or so if we
Hmm.
follow a certain kind of evolutionary trend.
Hmm.
So all that is to say, I'm convinced something is real, that they are real. The question is, what are they? And to answer that question fully, we kind of have to dive into what is reality, right? And who are we, right? These are the questions we need to ask. And I kind of lean towards the notion that it's not just one thing. There's likely many different forms, and they may be coming from different kinds of origin sources. And part of what I've been following is the work of people like Donald Hoffman, who've argued
Love
that
him.
yeah, it's great stuff because basically he says, what we perceive through our normal senses and kind of the default waking mode is only one small slice of what reality actually is. That in order to survive, we actually have to filter out the vast majority of data that's coming our way. And I would argue, including other kinds of beings that haven't been necessary for us to be aware of because they didn't directly impact our survival, like a lion would, kind of thing. So that's my big answer to the question. Aliens are real? I would say yes, but then it begs the question: what are they? How many kinds are there, etc.
Right. And I just want to make a note. Donald Hoffman is a cognitive psychologist and studies how our brain and our perception impacts how we see reality, and just basically that we don't see reality as it is, and there's a lot more to reality. Is that how you would kind of sum it up?
Yeah, he would actually even go as far as to say, we don't just even see a small slice of reality. We see something more like an interface with icons, like a computer screen, that really
Symbolic.
have almost no one-to-one, relationship with the underlying reality, right? So it goes. A lot of people, their assumption is the kind of intuition most scientists even have is that sure, maybe we don't see everything, but we're seeing what we see is accurate somehow. And Hoffman's argument is that it's more like a computer interface with icons. I see a trash icon on my screen, that doesn't at all represent what really that
Mm.
is, right? It's zeros
Hmm.
and ones and binary code, but it's useful to allow me to navigate around my computer. And so his argument is in the same way the evolutionary process has served up icons that have helped us move through the world in a way that we can survive, but it's not a one-to-one relationship at all with what underlying reality actually is.
Mm. Right. Yeah, that's really good. So do you want to kind of go into yeah, just why you think they're real? Um what evidence have you come by?
Yeah, and again, I think the question here is like, how wide do we open the aperture? Because let's start with, the modern UFO phenomenon, right? So from
Hmm.
around the 1940s or so, although you could go back before then. So maybe I will go back a bit before then. So even in the turn of the 20th century, there was people encountering strange flying objects that they called airships, which tended to look like the next generation of what was the cutting edge technology of the time. So kind of like blimp like, aircraft kind of thing was what they had at the time. So people would run into sometimes humanoid looking beings, sometimes a bit different than that were flying these airships, but they seemed to always be like a cutting edge or the next generation of what we had available. So they seem to sort of mirror human technology, but be something beyond that as well, which raises questions: were those really airships at all, or were they some kind of other intelligence's way of manifesting in a way that we would recognize, but would
Mm.
also stretch our imagination as well? Because as you look throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, we see that often happen, that whatever our conception of like cutting edge sci-fi kind of craft would look like, they tend to be just beyond that, right? So you have the flying saucers of the 40s and whatnot, and then you have things like the triangles in the 80s, right? Black triangles, and more recently, like the tic tac kind of oval kind of objects that were spotted in around 2004 and since then. So, number one, we have many, many, many sightings, right? And one thing that's been great about more recent technology is no longer just witness testimony, but we should say, speaking of witness testimony, this includes like expert witnesses, like pilots and whatnot, that are
Hmm.
trained by the military to know what's up there, right? They're aware of what our aircraft looks like, what enemy aircraft look like, what a satellite looks like, what a comet looks like, whatever, a star. Um, Strange looking clouds. They're trained to be expert witnesses because they have to make split second decisions. And they are reporting that they are seeing objects not only that look nothing like what they've been trained to recognize, but that are behaving with flight characteristics that kind of defy our understanding of how something could even stay aloft to begin with, right? So then it raises questions about, is this a new kind of physics? Are these defined physics? What's going on? They don't seem to have any known means of propulsion. We don't see any kind of heat signature. We don't see wings, right? So we don't even understand how they're staying aloft. They seem to be able to hover with, again, no means of being able to do that. They can make 90-degree turns at breakneck speed, which would crush a human being because of the G forces, right? So these are all things that have been observed, but defy our understanding of how flight is supposed to work. And we also more recently have all sorts of sensor technology that is also recognizing these things and capturing them, whether it's radar or various kinds of sensor systems that say something is there in physical reality because even our sensors are picking up. It's not just an optical illusion, in other words. And that's the sort of the sightings. Then, of course, another really key component is the interaction with the beings themselves, right? And this kind of has not been talked so much about in the mainstream. So even though the notion of UFOs or UAP, right, has increased recently, it's still the public is not really talking much about alien abductions, contact experiences.
Hmm.
Yet these also have been front and center, definitely in the 20th century, right? Where people interact with beings that not only show up and act like they're, Zeta Reticulans come here from some science expedition, but they actually seem to impact people spiritually and often, change their perspective on reality. Many people come away being less materialistic, less fearing of death, those kind of things that kind of mirror more what we think of as a spiritual encounter kind of thing, right? Which is my final point, kind of opens up the question of, again, even once you get past the surface veneer, are these perhaps the same kinds of encounters that have been happening across the wide scope of human history, and how we've, labeled them has changed, right? So in ancient days we might say a flying chariot or something, right, in the sky, because that's the only metaphor we had. Now we say something else, right, that again is comparison to what we have now. So many people now say, is that a drone, right? And that's because our latest cutting edge technology is a drone, but nevertheless they're doing things that even our cutting edge technology doesn't even get close to doing. And then you have to, reckon with all these encounters over time that not only just happen in physical reality, right, where people seem to wake up, many cases of people waking up with beings at the end of their bed that seem to be able to just pass through walls, right? Physical structures don't seem to stop them. But these people are often taken then either on board craft or onto some sort of alternate realm or alternate state of consciousness as well, which again speaks to some of the way people in the past might have talked about encounters with fairies or again kind of religious figures in deep history. So begs the question, what are they, what are we, and what's really going on here?
Yeah, that's great. I want to get back to that, but I want to go back a little bit and just, if someone was going to give rebuttal, they might say, is it possible that another nation maybe in secret has developed technology that we're not aware of, and
Right.
that somehow could be them? How would you answer that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think we definitely have to be honest about that and assess that. And I think the only reason why the UFO slash UAP, which by the way it used to stand for unidentified aerial phenomena, now they've expanded it to mean unidentified anomalous phenomena because we realize it's not just necessarily in the air that people are seeing things. Sometimes these things go in the ocean. Sometimes they seem to come out of solid rock. Um, but nevertheless, yeah, I think there are definitely going to be some things we encounter that might be just adversarial aircraft or something or cutting edge technology. But the key here is again touching on what I said before is the nature of these the way these things operate is so beyond us that we when we analyze it, when military experts analyze it, they can't come up with any kind of bizarre trend in history where
Hmm.
suddenly our adversaries like China or Russia would
Mm,
be suddenly so far ahead of us because it's a functionally completely different paradigm about how those things are in the air. Like they're not following any of the traditional understandings of how aircraft operate. And when you think about everything from the Wright brothers to an F-17, while they've become much more sophisticated, they still follow the same basic rules. You need propulsion, you need wings to
mhm.
keep you aloft, those kind of things. You still have to deal with G forces. When you make a sharp turn, you're going to make an arc, right? Because you've got to deal with that. These things do not seem to fly according to our understanding of how flight works. They make right angle turns that, again, not only seem impossible, based on just inertia and gravity and things like that, but would crush occupants, right? So it's just how next generation these things are, beyond even our conception of how we would even begin to know how to build something like that, that makes it, I would say, virtually impossible that they're actually adversarial aircraft.
Right. Yeah. Great answer. So I want to get back to, I think you made a great point about ancient aliens and history and how um, someone else made a good point that I was listening to. Like Hinduism, the gods are, they're green, they're blue, they're,
Right.
different. and then we do have ancient texts that kind of talk about this phenomenon, but obviously they're using the language of their time. They're using the symbology of what makes sense to them, like you said, like flying chariots. Um, so yeah, I think that's a good point.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think you raised a great point about Hinduism, right? Because sometimes in monotheistic religions, we tend to have fairly narrow conceptions of God being one thing, kind of God the Father, and some people kind of have
Hmm.
kind of really trite notions of, a grandfatherly figure sitting on a cloud or something, and angels playing harps and whatnot. But in some other traditions, yeah, we have a lot of sort of intermediate levels of deities,
Hmm.
right? Who do sometimes, like you say, have strange colorings and whatnot, strange um, different ways their faces are structured, which you could very well argue might be an early rendition of what they were encountering that we might call today a gray alien or something like that,
Hmm.
or a blue alien, because those are reported as well.
Right, right. And so going back to what you were talking about with craft, last podcast I had someone on, and we talked about my friend Brandon. We talked about dimensions, and that and then kind of there's string theory, and then there's many more dimensions in the third dimension that these beings might be operating um, out of these higher dimensions that might have a wider a deeper perspective understanding of these dimensions, how to operate in them, and that could explain how these crafts, or how they can come into our physical reality and seem to blip out as well. So I don't know if you wanted to speak more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, Jacques Vallée famously said about the UFO phenomenon that what the UFO phenomenon teaches us is that we do not understand space time. So he didn't say they've got some interesting tweaks on our understanding of space time. He was sort of saying what they do is so contrary to what we understand that it suggests that our fundamental understanding of reality is just wrong. Like
Hmm.
not just slightly off, but quite wrong, um, woefully incomplete, you could say. Maybe even barking up the wrong tree ultimately. Um, and so, yeah, like you say, there's these notions that they seem to blip in and blip out of reality, almost like they're coming in from a different kind of frame altogether. And in the 20th century, when the notion of multiple dimensions and even parallel universes kind of came into the fore,
Hmm.
then when people looked at the data from the UFO phenomenon, they said, oh, well, maybe that's what's happening, right? Maybe they're blipping in and out of a parallel universe or something, because they don't seem to be moving through space time as we understand it. But to your point about, you know, M theory, string theory, these different notions of a much more complex reality, and the fact that these others seem to demonstrate a much more robust understanding of the fundamental nature of reality, which allows them to manipulate space time, for instance, in ways that we just don't understand yet. I think that's absolutely key to where we need to go in trying to understand this more, and even scientific inquiry. And what's fascinating about that is one of the things I've done in my research over the last year or so is branch out into other fields of inquiry to see, is there kind of like a parallel in other fields that kind of pointing in this direction of space time being, maybe not fundamental. And so what we already talked about, Donald Hoffman's work, right, in
Hmm.
neuroscience and evolutionary biology and things like that. Um, and then we also have in quantum physics, we have cutting edge physicists like Nima Arkani Hamed, who are actually going so far as to say, we already know that space time cannot be foundational, right? It can't
Mm.
not be the fundamental fabric of reality. And he'll say things like space time is doomed, right? Which Donald Hoffman likes to quote him on that. And what he means by that is not that space time is about to blow up or something or implode, but that it is a model is doomed because we already know enough to know that it cannot be foundational. There must be a deeper structure from which we get like derivative aspects like space time and quantum theory. So, and he's already running experiments and even using mathematical models to try to depict what this might look like. What would the deeper structure be like so as to give you something like space time and quantum theory as a result, and as a byproduct kind of thing, right? So that's really fascinating to me that not only do we see evidence from these beings and craft that come into our reality, suggesting that there's something deeper than space time, that they might be even becoming from beyond our space-time construct, right? Which
Hmm.
stretches the notion that they're just ETs, right? That's where we get these notions of them being perhaps interdimensionals or something.
Hmm.
But I think it probably even goes beyond that, and that our notions right now, our models are just too limited, and we don't have enough even imagination to really know what we don't know. But they seem to be operating at this deeper structure. And what's interesting is in these different fields of inquiry, quantum physics being one of the key ones, we seem to see evidence that this deeper structure does exist, even if we never interact with it directly.
Right. Yeah. And that's all great. And that kind of that gets into consciousness. And as we Eastern religions have gone on about this, mystics a long time about that consciousness is fundamental, and that the materialists would say that consciousness is a product of our brain and chemical reactions. But I believe that doesn't really make sense, and that consciousness just uses um, physical reality to as a vehicle, as a tool for how to interact, and that depending on the tools using, whether it's a tree or our brain, it's different.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is one of the fundamental questions here, and I think that's what my research into these different fields has kind of led towards. That's why partly I called my podcast "Point of Convergence," is because we see these different fields all pointing in similar directions, kind of like a signpost pointing into the fog,
Mm,
saying reality is not what we think it is.
mhm,
Not just UFO phenomenon, but parapsychological research, psi phenomena, precognition, telekinesis, telepathy, those kind of things, and even like near-death experiences and out-of-body
mm,
experiences, right, where people seem to have, or even psychedelic journeys, right, where people have these extremely vivid and meaningful, right, experiences when their brains on a scan look pretty dormant, and that flies in the face of what physicalists would expect, right? If our mind experiences are just the epiphenomena of brain states, then we should see a corresponding brain state to make sense of the vivid experience we're having, and yet we don't see that. In fact, it seems like when the normal default mode of the brain shuts down, goes dormant, then it's like something beyond, something non-local to consciousness comes alive, right? And those experiences feel more real than this does, right? So these are fascinating notions to consider. And again, the current physicalist reductionistic materialism kind of mindset and mentality is fairly short-lived. We lived with a very different notion of reality for a very, very long time, even in different civilizations around the world. But because we've been able to transform our civilization so much and have cell phones and satellites and spacecraft and microwave ovens, because of our ability to model nature's behavior, we've kind of assumed that this notion of physicalism must be adequate, must accurately describe reality. But as a philosopher I like to follow named Bernardo Castro points out, what we've been able to do is model the behavior of nature. Doesn't mean we know what nature ultimately is or what it derives from, right? All you need to know is what it's going to do under certain conditions, and then you can develop technology to manipulate that and take advantage of it, right? But in the same way that in the Middle Ages we kind of, said willy nilly, okay, the priests are the ones to understand reality. We'll look to them to understand,
mhm,
because of the success of science in modeling nature and transforming our civilization. We've kind of done the same thing in modern times with scientists and just assumed that they must know what they're talking about ultimate reality, because they've been able to transform our civilization with technology. But again, that's really two separate matters. You can model nature and its behavior and transform a civilization on the physical level. That doesn't mean you ultimately understand what it is. We're back to the drawing board there, and all sorts of evidence seems to be suggesting that, again, not just in quantum theory and in neuroscience, right, the hard problem of consciousness in neuroscience is like how do we actually describe in any kind of coherent way how conscious experience arises from these neurochemical reactions in the physical brain. And it's kind of been this promissory note written by physicalists saying, well, we don't understand it yet, but one day we will, so just trust us. It must be an epiphenomena of the brain. Consciousness must be. But we can't even describe in a scientifically coherent way something like the smell of chocolate. Like how do
mm,
we have that conscious experience based on a brain state? And how could you, as this is what Donald Hoffman likes to point out, how would a brain state look for the smell of chocolate versus the smell of strawberries or something, or rose, right? We can't even do that, let alone adequately describe this vast array of consciousness and how consciousness is consistent over time, the sense of I amness, right? So yeah, so we've kind of come full circle where a lot of science is now beginning to, those who are bold anyway, and not afraid of going against the mainstream. There's this growing consensus, or at least momentum building, that we're kind of coming back around to, like you say, kind of an Eastern kind of spiritual notion, like non-duality, that everything is connected ultimately, and that consciousness is primary, and things like the physical world are epiphenomena of consciousness, not the other way around.
Yeah, great points. Great job. Yes, I think it's important to note. We're kind of getting into epistemology. How do we know truth, and what is truth? And science is kind of especially modern science is backed on the notion of materialism that it's what we can measure, what we can and the problem with that is that that's all physical, and so if there's something more than that, then they get stuck. And So I think that we're coming to the recognition and realization that phenomenology is important and something valuable to try to make sense out of. And I think science is we're starting to get there and see how can we make sense of this, even if um, we're kind of on the edge of our ability to measure things physically and all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points. And I think a couple things come to mind there. One is that one of the things we've seen, like as an implication of the double slit experiment with quantum experiments, whatnot, is that you can't actually really separate the observer from the
Hmm.
environment he or she is trying to observe, right? So this notion that we can objectively be able to identify variables that we can control for 100% of the time so that we can have a strong sense that we know what's going on, that kind of goes out the door a little bit with quantum theory and quantum experiments. um, and it just goes to show that it's more like what happened with science was, again, because there was so much confidence about what scientific theory and the scientific method was able to give us in terms of a better, more robust understanding of what goes on around us, right? The behavior of nature, that we became so confident about that. I would say, verging on hubris, right?
Hmm.
Where we said, how about we just say this is all there really is, right? How about we say that things like that fuzzy feeling of love and the numinous and the smell of a rose, and even the feeling that I am something, and I was also here last week and 5 years ago. It's gone so far as that some physicalists will actually posit that consciousness is actually an illusion, right? That it's some sort of not either the machinations of the physical brain, or it's some sort of weird illusion that we live with. And yet, of course, what's ironic about that is that, the one thing we can be sure of is that we're having conscious experience. You and I
Hmm.
wouldn't be having this conversation. We wouldn't be conducting scientific experiments if we didn't have conscious experience, right?
Hmm.
So to try to like, wash that away like it doesn't matter, when it like, undergirds the entire endeavor, is
Right.
quite curious, to say the least.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, that's good. So I guess maybe backing up a little bit, how did you get into this in the first place? I know I've listened to your podcast. You have your own personal experience.
Yeah, so I would say that, there was a time where I was a pretty hardcore left brain, reductionist, hyper rationalist kind of thing. Went through that season of life, um, and and really what changed that for me, which is true for I think a lot of people, is personal experience. Not just knowing people that have had experiences, people that I trust and seem very credible to me, and I know they know how to distinguish the difference between an illusion or having bad pizza and seeing something in a dream versus actually experiencing something that seemed to be manifesting in what we consider physical reality or something like that.
Hmm.
So I met people like that. uh, my ex-wife was also one of those people who just when she was really really young, her mom saw so many things happening around her that even though they came from a sort of pseudo Christian tradition, she took her to a kind of a medium one time to find out what was going on. And as soon as the medium saw her walk in as a little girl, she said, "Oh, oh boy, you're a conduit. Like, they're coming to you whether you want it or not, kind of thing.
Mhm.
So that's kind of been was my experience with her too. We would experience things together that I could not explain away after a period of time, right? You can explain it away once or twice, but not when it keeps happening. And one of the key turning points for me was an event that didn't actually originally strike me as something associated with the UFO phenomenon. The more you look into this and research it, you recognize it's a broader and deeper, phenomenology than many people realize. So what happened was in 2005, we were traveling across the country, and she was pregnant with our son at the time. And in the early morning hours in the hotel, um, I awoke to see kind of a female entity at the end of the bed. And at first thought it might be our 3-year-old daughter who was in sleep in the bed next to us. But she was still in the bed, and this being
Mhm.
was too big to be her, really. But your brain sort of like fights to understand what are you seeing, right? Because it kind of had an ethereal quality to it as well. Um, Anyway, I proceeded to get up out of bed and walk towards this entity, this female entity, and it proceeded to go pass right through the wall. And then I did a very, very strange thing, which I only later learned out is quite common. I turned around and went right back to bed, as if like nothing big. I got up and got a glass of milk or something, right? Um, but thankfully, and this is so key here, that speaks to maybe how often this may be happening and people just don't realize it even, is my ex-wife also saw it, right? So she sort of shook me out of my stupor and said, "What are you doing going to sleep? You know what we just saw? Like, what are we going to do about it?" kind of thing. And what's also interesting is I turned around to come back to bed. She saw the entity come back through the wall, proceed to walk down the length of the hotel room, and then through the front door, not open the front door, but walk through the front door, right?
Oh, wow.
Um, so we kind of talked it over, decided not to stick around for the continental breakfast, and we just kind of got out of there, kind of thing. Um, but that always stuck with me, and I didn't know what to do with that. I remember emailing people, and I didn't have any notion that this could be associated with the UFO phenomenon. But I think one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that humanoid and even human looking others are quite common. They're one of the most common types that are identified that people encounter, other than kinds of light beings or balls of light and or the short and tall grays. But besides that, the humanoid and human looking beings are the ones most commonly encountered, actually. And this thing where they actually are able to control your behavior, where you do things that seem counterintuitive, like going to bed right after you saw something like this, right? Or people walking outside and are going to see this amazing UFO display, and they forget to take a picture. They forget to take a picture, right? Even though they may
Mhm.
be avid photographers, right? Just things that again skeptics easily attach onto and say, "Ah, come on, what are the chances that would happen?" Right? But one of the key data points in this phenomenon is that they do seem to be able to impact our perception and even our consciousness and even our behavior, right? So
Mm.
this shows you how much the consciousness piece is central to this phenomenon. So I've had experiences like that, and then more recently last year I was invited to this private retreat at the Monroe Institute, which is kind of known for their astral travel stuff and even some experiments the CIA was conducting back in the 70s, right? So we kind of combined all these kind of like parapsychological elements together. We practice telepathy, we practice remote viewing, we also practice CE5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, or HICE, which stands for Human Initiated Contact Events, where you basically send out this positive intention for benevolent others to interact with you. And this is a well known kind of set of protocols going back to Stephen Greer, but certainly not just associated with him. There was a group called Mission Rama in South America that was doing this well before he was. And the notion is you come together, you sort of form a coherent field of intention with group of people, although you could do it on your own as well. But in this case, we did it as a group of people. We kind of we had been in our little cubicles at the Monroe Institute, and then hearing these audio signals coming through the wall and sort of preparing ourselves for what we were going to do. And then we all joined in this meadow, and then had this shared intention to interact with phenomena in the sky. And sure enough, we had numerous sightings and got a lot of it on film as well. We had a professional uh, person with a really high end camera that filmed this, and we submitted to MUFON, and they concluded that sure enough, it was anomalous. They couldn't account for what it was. But what's also interesting is that we had a random number generator on the side of the mountain that also went non-random, not just when the UAP showed up and things were happening in the sky, but also even when we join together in that shared intention. At that very moment, you also see this random number generator go non-random. So in other words, it's kind of like flipping a dice, right? Or rolling a dice, or even flipping a coin, right? It's supposed to be 1 0 1 0, basically, is that kind of follows that format. So that after 5 minutes, you're going to have about 50% ones, 50%
Mhm.
zeros, right? Just like flipping a coin, heads and tails. But what happens is we see repeated evidence that when people interact with consciousness, we can make things like computers go non-random, programs go non-random, right? Which begs the question, because again, according to a physicalist paradigm that thinks that your consciousness is like locked inside your skull and
Right.
mine's locked inside my skull, how, number one, could telepathy or something like psychic powers ever exist? But how on in the world could you actually make a random number generator on the side of a mountain go non-random just by mental intention alone, basically?
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, so I had numerous encounters and have seen things since then as well. Have in meditation practice kind of stumbled upon a kind of a contact experience with feeling and sensing that something's talking back to me, and sometimes I would even wake up with notions in my head, fragments of information that I didn't know how they fit exactly, but as I walk through my week they begin to make sense. It slots into here and there, so it kind of feels precognitive in that sense too sometimes. So yeah, I've had an array of experiences and am now associated with an array of people that I see as trustworthy, who are also having these experiences. And thankfully, we've progressed enough that this isn't nearly as scandalous and worthy of mocking as it used to be, right? Because when the UFO phenomenon was flaring up in the 20th century, the U.S. government was doing its darndest to discredit those who reported
Mhm.
sightings and encounters. That's beginning to change, right? Especially since 2017, when that famous article came out in the New York Times, actually documenting video and photographic evidence of UAP that the military had captured. So yeah, but that's the long answer to your question in terms of yes, I've had my own encounters, and that's informed my perspective, certainly.
Yeah, that's great. And I've talked to people, unnamed, who've taken psychedelics and have had experiences with ETs as well. And yeah, you were just getting into my next question, talking about the military, and um, so why did the military try to discredit people, and are now they came out and say that we admit there's UFOs and we've seen them for a long time.
Right. It's a fascinating question, right? Like what how did the calculus change and why, right? So in the 20th century, we have to remember that any event is embedded within a historical context, right? So
Hmm.
a lot of this happened, in the midst of the Cold War, right? So the first thing that the U.S. government was trying to find out was, could this be, Soviet kind of aircraft we're seeing, or even like the remnants of sort of some breakaway Nazi technology or something that we're seeing, right?
Hmm.
Um, but in the midst of the Cold War, there was this concern that, because again, that's the contextual framework, that not only were sightings had of these things, but there was supposedly, and now we have a lot of evidence to suggest there were sometimes crashes, right? Which begs the question: how does a spacecraft successfully fly from Alpha Centauri and then crash when they try to navigate the atmosphere of the planet? Seems unlikely, right? I think one of the things this phenomenon challenges you on is your assumptions. You really have to put your assumptions aside and just try to look at the data. The data suggests we've had crashes, and the U.S. government has been able to retrieve some of those vehicles. So this is not, we're well beyond optical illusions at this point. We are definitely, like hard knock on it, it makes a sound. Technology has been captured and taken to places like Wright Patterson Air Force Base and other places. Area 51 comes to mind. There's a there in these kind of the folklore that's risen up around this. But of course, the concern, if you're a U.S. military and you're recovering craft, your concern is, what if the Soviets are doing it too, and what
Hmm.
if they can reverse engineer it, right? And then suddenly have a huge advantage over us. And on top of that, it was not just technology that was sort of next generation. It was so next generation that it was quite shocking and concerning to the US military because we would have no defense against it. If this whatever is operating these things decided to invade the earth or whatever, we would not be able to stop them. Not only
Mhm.
because the technology is so advanced, but they also seem to be able to control our perception of space time and even our behavior, right? So you don't even have to worry about disarming a group if you can just control their behavior,
Mhm.
remotely, and everything, right? So if you're a government and you're a military whose entire purpose is to defend the population, and you know darn well you're seeing evidence of technology and capacities that you couldn't begin to defend against, then you just don't talk about it. You don't, hold a press conference and say, "I hate to say this, but this is what's going on. We can't do anything."
We're
Okay,
not safe.
yeah, yeah.
Uh-huh.
I mean, when people are, having these beings show up at the end of their beds, you could have an entire brigade, military brigade outside. It's not going to stop them. They
Mhm.
pass through walls. They can put people into suspended animation. Like I know cases where people, when they were young, they'd be sitting around a dinner table and eating with their family, and suddenly the entire family would like freeze, like mid bite, spoon
Mhm.
halfway to the mouth, and while this person still can move around, and then gray aliens walk in. So seem to be able to suspend even our local space time, which again I think speaks to this notion that space time cannot be foundational; it must be a construct, and they seem to be able to actually like manipulate that directly. So they
Mhm.
may not even be operating within space time with these craft. They may be manipulating space time around these craft, right?
Mm.
Which is really, I've seen evidence that maybe is what's going on, that kind of level. So that really, is a whole different kind of level of paradigm. So, when the midst of the Cold War was going on and we knew that we could not defend against these things if we needed to, then we just, on the one hand, publicly scoffed at the whole thing and said there's nothing there, right? And, Project Blue Book and these different operations were basically a front, right? A ruse, because they acted like they were looking into it. But the whole point was to say, turns out it's all swamp gas. People saw the planet Venus, people had too much to drink, whatever, like this person's mentally unstable. And if there ever was a credible person who really was saying, no, I know what I saw and it's this and this, they would go so far as to like basically try to character assassinate these people, right? Sometimes they would lose their jobs and whatnot. And even military people that threatened to talk about it, they would lose
Mhm.
their pension, you'll be discharged dishonorably and all that kind of thing. So they were on the inside, uh, frantically trying to understand this, right? They were really looking into it. They knew there was a there, but then publicly saying nothing to see here, folks, please move on. I think one of the reasons why it changed, to answer the second part of your question, maybe around 2017, is partly because we live in a very different era right now, right?
Mm.
With social media, with everyone having what account is the equivalent of a high end camera compared to what was the 70s or 80s, right? Yeah, everyone carry ones around in their pocket. They can take video, they can take photos. So there was this famous flap that happened in the 90s in Phoenix, the Phoenix lights, and these kind of slow moving black triangles that seemed to pass over the city, massive objects, and many people saw it, including the governor of the state at the time. And if that were to happen today, we would have, social media would be lit up, right, with everyone,
Mhm.
like thousands and thousands and thousands, like probably hundreds of thousands of videos and photographs, right? So I think on the one hand, they know it's not something that's easily containable like it used to be, right? Like how many people back in the 50s were carrying around cameras to take photos of these things? And there was no social media to go, hey, you're not going to believe what I just saw, right? It was like slow moving. Maybe a few of your neighbors find out, but then you don't even really want to tell your neighbors because the US military is doing a good job of convincing you that those people are crazy, right?
Right.
So that we're in a very different social kind of dynamic now, and technological dynamic. The last piece, though, may be that there's been some talk, and even an ex CIA analyst named John Ramirez has talked about saying that intelligence circles have known that something major is coming in the 2020s, maybe around 2026, 2027, and they've known about this for some time. And so the shift in policy in 2017 was basically a slow run up of desensitizing people to these notions so that when whatever happens in 2026, 27 happens, it's not such a shock to the system. So they've long wanted to keep this secret and under wraps. But once they have become convinced that number one, they can't contain it like they used to, because of social media and phones and whatnot. But that also something may be happening in our future that at this point they have no choice but to try to slowly prepare people for it, but in kind of a slow bleed kind of disclosure, right? So that people don't get the shock all in one go, but that over time they become more and more familiar with these notions, so that when it actually happens, if it happens, this major event, then people are not so completely taken off guard.
Hmm. That's good. Um, That's really fascinating. I have not heard about the 2026 event. I want to get to that, but I think we should say that for a little bit later. Just want to say about technology. It's funny. I think we kind of hit a sweet spot, and now we've passed that. So the sweet spot was, hey, we have technology, we can capture this ourselves, and but now technology is so advanced, we can fake stuff. So it's like, well, what is credible? So I think it was here, and now it's kind of gone. So it's kind of gone the other way. It's
Totally
kind of
true, right?
funny.
I mean, you can go on Facebook or Twitter and you can see thousands of what look like amazing videos and photographs, but with Photoshop and CGI, you really at the point where you can't trust the naked eye, right? So some people will still say, I don't know, man, that looks like CGI," and I'm like, we're beyond being able to
Hmm.
distinguish with the naked eye whether or not that's CGI. You need like really advanced, like photo analysis kind of software, like digital analysis, forensic analysis. So you're excellent point. We actually are past that now. And even if people did capture actual footage, half the people would say that's fake, that's
Right.
CGI, right? So we're at that place now. Yeah.
Mhm. Oh, I just want to make a note. I thought it was really interesting. I was talking to someone, and he said something I never thought of before. And this may or may not be true, but you know, if you think about it, in history, until recently, our technology has been very antiquated. It's not been very advanced, but it's really advanced the last 100 years or so. And he said, he believes that it was the ETs that gave us this technology, and that's why we've advanced so quickly. I don't know if you've heard or thought about that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the narratives that kind of gets tossed around, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I think um, one of the more shocking aspects of disclosure is not just who these others are and how many there are and how many different origin sources they have, but also the degree to which the official institutions of humanity have gone out of their way not only to suppress that information but also to create false narratives, so that much of what we've learned about 20th century history is false and is deliberately like scrubbing the UFO phenomenon from the picture. So not only do we have lots of evidence that, for instance, NASA was scrubbing photos for a long time that were taken, and that astronauts that go up into space have to sign non-disclosure agreements because they regularly see stuff, right? But on top of that, we have not just a scrubbing, but a a false narrative that's been presented about 20th century history. Uh, Colonel Philip Corso came out with a book the day after Roswell, I think it was, and he talks about that basically he was in charge of a division that was all about. I mean, people might have superficially thought that he was dealing with, recovered Soviet craft, crashed craft, and whatnot, and was trying to work on reverse engineering that. But what he actually says is that it was no, it was recovered craft from like places like Roswell, right, where we actually had all sorts of wreckage that we can then reverse engineer, right? We can say,
Mm,
how does this thing work? How would you construct it? Blah blah blah. And so yeah, in his book, he basically makes that exact point you're saying, that many of the leaps in technology we saw happen in the 20th century were because of reverse engineered technology that had been recovered from ET craft and whatnot.
mm. Right, that's good. I've heard from someone that there's kind of three groups that have to do with UFOs that are into it or in the know, whatever. There's the military, there's the disclosure group, and then there's kind of the spiritual new age. And so, I was wondering if you wanted to get into that and how they're tied or into UFOs and ETs.
Right. Yeah, that's a really important one, I think, because we've not had the academy, science and universities really studying this, right? Because they haven't felt that they could, even if they wanted to.
Hmm.
Uh, I sometimes hear from academics who would love to study this, but still are not convinced that the environment is safe enough for them to do so, right? when John Mack was actually interviewing abductees and contactees back in the 90s and saying these people are not delusional. They're not demonstrating any kind of mental illness. They seem like well-grounded people, and on top of that they seem to demonstrate the signs of post-traumatic syndrome, suggesting that
Mhm.
they really did encounter something, because you can't fake that, right? If your body's having those kind of reactions, has registered something happening to you, right? But Harvard basically tried to, take away his credentials and, kick him out of his position, basically, because he dared to say this stuff was in some way real, right? That's all he was doing. And
Mhm.
the irony is, in science and the academy, we're supposed to be able to ask the biggest questions, right? Inquiry is supposed to be what it's all about. But he dared to, to go outside the box. And there's this one famous case where someone said to him, if John, if you had just come forward and said, you discovered a new pathology that you wanted to add to the, to the array of pathologies, that would have been fine. But instead, you chose, like, you wanted to redefine reality. The data took him, right? So you go where the data takes you, no matter how much it's, challenges our paradigms. But yeah, to your question about the different groups, the reason why I bring that up is because science and the academy has avoided this topic. People kind of go in with their assumptions and their preconceived notions of what this is, and there's no kind of scientific rigor applied to it to demonstrate this is my hypothesis and this is what the evidence supports it, is or not, right? So you get some in the sort of spiritual crowd who will come in, and it's one of two things: it's either all demons and darkness, right,
Mhm.
or it's all love and light, right? So you,
Mhm.
you kind of get
Right.
those two things, and a lot of it comes down to people just, you know, leaning towards whatever reality they prefer, right? If they prefer
Right.
a reality where everything coming from beyond is better than us, is pure, is like, complete goodness, then they're going to see that, and even go so far as to either explain away the negative encounters or the things that seem more even neutral. They'll just say, well, you probably just have some stuff you haven't worked through, some shadow work you need to do. And so, if you did that, you would not have those kind of encounters, right? So they
Mhm.
basically blame the people who are having the bad encounters. Um, and you've got the sort of the sort of standard ufological crowd who were convinced this was all like a sci-fi ET thing, right? These must be space aliens coming from Zeta Reticuli or whatever. And so anything to do with spirituality or the ability to manipulate consciousness, things like that, they actually wanted to ignore that part of the data because they wanted the academy to take them seriously. So they would actually, like, just squeeze out this one little bit of data and say, this is what it is, right? And willfully ignore other aspects of data. So that's what we kind of have. We have these different groups that I would suggest to have any of those opinions in a really rigid way. You have to ignore parts of the data or just not be very familiar with the full data. And when I look at the full data, I think what we see is a plethora of phenomenology, and people experiencing different kinds of entities um, across the board. Some very benevolent, some neutral, sometimes some negative. Now, I'll just say as a caveat that there are times where just this sheer ontological shock, which is something that John Mack coined, of just seeing something that is not supposed to be there, right?
Mhm.
You've been taught your whole life should not be there, let alone at the end of your bed when you have doors locked right in the middle of the night. Um, that alone can put us in that kind of fight or flight evolutionary response. So at first it'll feel like that's darn negative. There's no way to
Right.
paint it any other way. But sometimes over time, when people have had time to reflect, they realize, actually, I don't think that thing meant me any harm. Like I actually had an encounter with a mountain lion one time. I was hiking in a park, like, you know, miles away from civilization, basically by myself, shorts and a t-shirt, and a mountain lion walked out from behind a tree. And you can guarantee all the adrenaline in my body said, this thing's bad, this is dangerous,
Mhm.
I'm gonna survive, right? Um, but I got away, even though there was one point where it chased me, but I realized it was chasing me because I was running, right? So it's kind of like that predator prey thing kicked in, but
Mhm.
it's that, like, evil intent, right? And only in retrospect, when I thought, never once did I see it kind of like crouching like it wanted to jump. Never did I hear a growl. I just realized it was curious, right? But my initial response was absolute fear and ascribing, like, negative intent to this thing that didn't have any negative intent. If
Mm,
it had intended to eat me for lunch, mountain lion behavior is to jump from behind, snap your neck and drag you away. And he could have done that, right? Because
mm,
came up from behind me, but didn't, just walked around in front of me. Anyway, all that is to say, there's that aspect too, that sometimes just a sheer shock puts us in the negative category for people for a while, but then they come to actually see it as positive over time. So the majority of cases actually are towards the positive. But all it is to say, yeah, absolutely. You've got these different groups that are convinced it's this thing, and this other group thinks it's something else, and they don't speak to each other, and they try to sort of discredit each other. And I think you can only, I think, get to that conclusion if you're not really being honest about the full data. Is what I would say.
mm. Right. Yeah, that's great. Um, and that gets my next question, but I want to go back real quick. And, maybe this is the first thing we should have said is kind of bland now, but I think that, our continued exploration of space and, with the Hubble telescope and the pictures we've gotten and the realization that there's other planets out there that are like Earth. That are habitable for life, that just a statistical probability of being alive is astronomical. um and of course, we mentioned different dimensions, and so even if other planets don't seem habitable, that doesn't mean another dimension they aren't, or that's even a higher dimensions that you need to reside on a planet, or whatever that means.
Right.
And so maybe they're in a higher dimension and we can't see them.
Yeah, exactly. Great points. I mean, yeah. So the first thing that's really shifted from the middle part of the 20th century, like back then, people initially thought these were aliens coming from Mars or Venus, right? Because that
Mm,
our scope of concern and awareness was not very broad at that point. But as time went on, we realized that according to our conventional understandings of life, places like Venus and Mars do not seem habitable, don't seem conducive to nurturing life. But as you said, like we explored more and more of the cosmos, we find that even though the kinds of planets that would be in that Goldilocks zone of even what the narrow definition we have of life, even though those planets are very rare, nevertheless, the cosmos is just so flippin' big, like mind blowing. You can't wrap your mind around it, right?
right.
That there's going to be so many galaxies and so many star systems that have still millions, maybe more of those kinds of planets alone, right? So in other words, even if it's the exception to the rule that you have a planet like Earth that could, support life as we understand it, there's still going to be plenty of those, right? And again, like you pointed out, that's just according to our narrow definition of life. The more we study even our own planet, we find life springing up in sometimes the most inhospitable kinds of environments, right? Like in like a sulfur cloud or something like that, right? So who knows what kind of life could spring up, like you say, that we don't even necessarily register because it's not been part of our evolutionary process. To why would we need to know about like gaseous snakes that exist in a nebulous cloud somewhere in the stars when we never had to deal with that in our ongoing evolution, right? So there's
Hmm.
this you know and like you say, that just assumes like one physical cosmos, right, as being the
Right.
totality of everything that is. If you have parallel universes or different dimensions, if then it opens up all sorts of new possibilities. If we find that space time, as we've been sort of pointing towards, is actually not the foundational construct anyway, then who knows what's beyond that, right? So Donald Hoffman would say he believes that reality is teeming with life, but we've been looking in the wrong place. We've been looking
Mm,
on our interface, right,
hmm.
of our computer, right, and looking for icons of aliens when really they're likely all outside of our desktop or our laptop. We just haven't had the perceptual ability to perceive them up until now. So yeah, that this is something that's really shifted, uh, and it's a bit of a farce actually because you have groups like SETI, studying the distant reaches of the cosmos, trying to look for signs of biological life
Right.
under very narrow parameters, right? Like parameters that would have showed up as the way human civilization would have showed up like with radio waves and things like in 1960 or something, right? So if you have groups that are so advanced because the age of the cosmos is so diverse, right? Some areas are so much older than others.
Hmm.
You could have civilizations that could be hundreds of millions of years beyond us, and we think about how much our technology has changed in 100 years, right? Going
Right.
from a horse and buggy to spacecraft that have now left the solar system in 100 years. So we can't even fathom what a million or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of years would go get you to. And for sure, without a doubt, if we have any inkling of imagination, we should recognize that at that point we're dealing with a scope that we can't even conceive of. So to assume that we have the capacity to exhaustively look for and find life is again an example of hubris, I would suggest. But
Hmm.
but again, the farce I was speaking of is that while SETI's looking out there, we have all this evidence that they're already here, right, and interacting with us, and may have been around longer than we have. It may be more
Hmm.
their planet than it's ours. Like these are again
Hmm.
assumptions we bring to the table.
Right. Wow. Great points. So thank you for touching on my next question of ETs. Why are they here, and what do they have to do with us? I think when I was younger, I was like, oh, aliens, they're probably true. But I just like why do I care? And until I figured out um, more what the purpose was, that's what really drew my interest in.
Right. So your question is about what is their purpose? Why are they here?
Yeah, what do they have to do with us? Their
Right,
interaction with
right,
us.
right. Excellent question. Yeah, I mean that in some ways is the $1 million question, because again, the sort of sci-fi notions that some ufologists wanted to limit this to was that it must be some sort of like Star Trek kind of thing, right? That they're just like traveling the cosmos and boldly going where no gray alien has gone before, right? but uh, but that's not what we see. We see, when you think about someone like Jacques Vallée and how his work leads him to believe that we may be dealing with one phenomenon over the full expanse of human history, but that just manifests in different ways, perhaps partly because we interpret it based on our current cultural milieu, but also maybe because they have the power to interact with our collective consciousness and show us things that not only um, seem resonant, but are also like taking us to the next level. Like they're actually designed to make us expand our consciousness and our imagination.
Mm,
So he gets to this notion of a control system hypothesis, where he believes they are deliberately, most of the time, staying on the sidelines and beyond our perceptual awareness, but that are nevertheless, over time, in the business of shaping the course of human civilization, and that they have been from the beginning, which takes us back to our earlier conversation about religions and religious history. And is that perhaps the same thing, right? Like that those were earlier iterations of this control system that's designed to shape the direction of human consciousness over time as we grow in our abilities through the evolutionary process or whatever mechanism you want to believe. We grow in our abilities to perceive more. They slowly give us more and expand our notions, transcend our previous notions, so as to lead us to some sort of growing awareness, right? That may result in eventually us getting to the point where we're ready enough for them to show themselves in the light of day, kind of thing, right? Because this has been one of the questions, right? The skeptics bring up, if they're here, why don't they land on the White House lawn or Central Park?
mhm,
And one of the arguments is because they just don't see us as being ready. And on top of that, they don't want to do our homework for us. They want to actually stand on the sidelines and try to inspire us in different ways, maybe. There's all sorts of evidence that great artists throughout history, as well as great technologists and people who've been cutting edge scientists, have often downloaded notions that change the course of human civilization that they feel like they don't know how it came to them in a dream or
mm,
whatever. So this could be this like seeding of ideas coming from outside without ever showing yourself, right? It's kind of like mom or dad coming in and like putting some money where your tooth came out that day under your pillow and then going out back out of the room again, right? That kind of thing. Um, so I think that's what's in play. But I would also say that again, I think there are many different types of entities here, and this is not just me liking that idea because it sounds fun. But again, I look at people like Donald Hoffman, and I look at the notions of space time from Nimar Kani Hamed and whatnot. And my sense is that it's much more likely that not that there's just one or two more types of life forms, and even like origins for life forms, but probably many, many more. So I think there's some overarching intelligence, sort of at the highest levels, and if you had kind of a spectrum of consciousness development, where not only do you understand the physical environment more as you develop, like we have compared to our ancestors, but you eventually get to the point, if consciousness is primary and fundamental, you begin to work at that substrate where you can actually, you don't need to have a door or window. You just go right through the wall, because at that point, the wall or physical reality as we perceive it is basically just a thought form for some of these others, right? So they just change it with mental intention alone. So I think at the most expanded kind of perspective, some of those are definitely trying to shape our evolution. And that might have been, you know, something like what people consider an angel in the past, right? Or something more like an alien today, right? I have a friend who her mother experienced something like that when she was younger, and she called it an angel. But when we asked her to describe it, it sounds exactly like what people in ufology would call a light being, right?
Hmm.
These sort of like rays of light kind of dancing in a prism in front of her, kind of thing. So, what we call these things so much comes down to what categories we have available. But I think when you look at it in the most expansive way, while there's many different groups doing different things on different agendas, I think overall there's also this overarching group that seems to be trying to shape the entire course of our civilization. That's what they have to do with us in the big picture.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and going back to what you're saying about there being, some ETs trying to help us, and then maybe some that are more nefarious. If we go back to ancient times and the mythology of Inki and Lil, uh, it seemed that one was using the human race as kind of slaves. To get things from us, and then the other one was saying, hey, you know what, they need to have free will, they need to have intelligence, and not be slaves, that's not right. um, and so we see from the beginning that that there was these these two competing forces. Or um, do you do you think that ETs have that there was a period of kind of separation of them not being so involved with us, and then until recently that
Right.
has they've resolved their contact with us and interaction.
Yeah, there seems to have definitely been a ramping up, and I would say that's even increasing. You could almost argue exponentially in recent times, which I think everybody that I know that is kind of involved in this topic senses that there are a lot of things changing, right? And the
Hmm.
question is why, and what does this portend, you know? Um, but definitely in the 1940s, we have this sudden uptick in the number of sightings and interactions right at the dawn of the atomic era, right? So that
That's what I
seems
was going to
like,
go into. Yeah.
yeah, seems like too much of a coincidence, right? To not pay attention to. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Like if you were a group that's kind of like hanging on the sidelines and letting the kids play, right? Like Lord of
Hmm.
the Flies or something. That's one thing when they have sticks and stones and clubs, right?
Hmm.
Catapults, even cannons. But when they get to the point when they're like ripping apart the fabric of reality by splitting the atom, right? Then you're like, whoa, this is getting out of control. We need to step up our game and somehow try to redirect here. So then you have, not only increased sightings, but then sightings that have to do specifically with nuclear technology, like this phenomena where they often show up at our nuclear facilities and actually can
Hmm.
disarm our silos, right? So that if,
Hmm.
if during the Cold War, if the Soviets had launched an attack, there are times where we just would not be able to respond because they can just remotely take our missile silos offline. So, and some people have suggested that's like a coded message, like, "What are you doing? Why do you have enough weapons to like destroy the world several times over?
Hmm.
What's the point? Do you not see how you're all connected to each other and connected to source? Blah blah blah." So, the famous Trinity crash uh, that Jacques Vallée documented in his most recent book was at the very site of the very first atomic bomb test, right? The Trinity site, right? So, what are the chances that one of the first recorded events of a UFO crash was at the very, very location where we happened to detonate the first atomic bomb that very same year? So, you have time and place
Hmm.
overlapping, right? So, certainly seems to suggest that there's a relationship there, right? That's pointing towards something. And on top of that, we've got, speaking of technology and developments, we're now got AI, right? That is
Hmm.
quickly outpacing our understanding of how it's not only how it's going to impact our world, but even how it's even working, right? I have friends who are again, my background is partly in software engineering, so I understand some of the models that are used to train some of these systems, and I have friends who are really on the inside in terms of understanding the cutting edge technology with AI, and they get to the point where there seems to be this kind of multi-dimensional kind of calculation happening that ends up with the right answer, but we're not able to determine how it got to the right answer, right?
Right.
Which begs the question: could at some point it be operating so quickly and so powerfully that we would just suddenly not have the ability to stop it? And you're kind of like in Terminator territory, right?
Right. It's Elon Musk warns.
Exactly, exactly. So now we get this like crazy historical event where all these leading, technologists join forces and saying we need to just stop. We need to put a pause. When
Right.
in our history have we ever paused the development of technology? Right?
Mhm.
They're saying this is such a threat to our civilization, not maybe just because you could have a Skynet kind of thing like Terminator where they turn against us, but even just how destabilizing it'll be for the economy, right? That
Mm.
we don't have an economy that can handle mass shift in suddenly robots and AI being able to do 70% of the jobs that used to be done
Right.
by humans, right?
Mhm.
So this is a real thing to think about. Now, I'll just say as an aside, if we do give it some thought, we could actually end up with something like um, you know, a kind of a basic income that's
Mm.
supplied to the populace by taxing these systems that basically could run everything else, right? We could
Mhm.
actually use this as a tool to transform the nature of people's relationship with work, right? We don't necessarily all have to keep working in the future. We could have robots and AI doing a lot of that, and on top of that, they could also help solve many of our most challenging conundrums around, climate change and distribution of resources, right? So capitalism has been the best of some bad models, right? Just pragmatically. But now we have an opportunity to actually move beyond that, to just transcend that, if our consciousness would allow it. The biggest challenge I see right now in all this is not AI. The problem is that our consciousness is still stuck in a zero sum game where
Mhm.
someone's going to try to game the AI system to get all the cookies at the expense of everyone else. If we were to use that, if our consciousness was such that we could operate as a collective, AI could be an incredible tool to move us forward. But unfortunately, we're not there yet. So it's more about us than it, really. Um, but yeah, what was the original question?
Right. This is great. You're bleeding into another podcast episode I want to have about AI specifically.
Right. Yeah.
uh, maybe we'll have to have you on as well as my other friend on this.
Right.
This great stuff. Um, yeah, we're just talking about ETs and their agenda for with us. I don't know if you at this point would be a good to get into 2026 event that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the other really interesting aspects of this phenomenon that also kind of relates to religious history, which maybe again suggests that maybe there's a there, that there's something overarchingly true about all of it, right? That's somehow connected. Is this sense of kind of like an end times or an eschaton or an apocalypse, right? A cataclysm. So many people who encounter even very positive beings, ones they perceive as very benevolent, will be shown apocalyptic images of the earth, right? Almost like reminiscent of the Book of Revelation, right? That kind
Mhm.
of thing. And sometimes it's quite symbolic, like things like seeing the earth on fire from space, which is not likely going to be what they'll see, but it symbolically just says the earth in severe distress, right?
Mhm.
So all that is to say, many experiencers, the people who've encountered the beings and even had sightings and then had kind of telepathic communication, have sensed that some sort of apocalypse is coming. That part of the uptick. This is what we're getting at. I remember now. The question was around:
Mhm.
is there been an uptick in the number of sightings and
Right.
interactions and intervention? Right before I got on the AI tangent, uh, but yeah, it's there seems to be, and one of the suggestions is it could be related to this kind of potential coming cataclysm, right? That say if this some groups or some intelligence had seeded our civilization, like the very origins of our civilization, perhaps, came from some sort of seeding program, then maybe it gets to a certain point where it's time for the report card, and either you pass the course or you don't, and maybe we're at a point now where, again, because we are so, even though our consciousness seems kind of bottlenecked, our technology keeps increasing in its capacity, right? So not only do we have kind of a collective insanity on our planet where we have all these weapons pointing towards each other, and now we've got nations doing all this development work on bioweapons, right, which are just as dangerous, if not more, than nuclear weapons, right? And now you've got we're becoming more and more of an information economy. Now you've got people looking into like techno weapons, right, and try to EMP pulses or whatever to wipe out the infrastructure of another country, right? So these are all signs that our technology is increasing. We can now, speaking of Elon Musk, wants to take us to Mars, right? So wants to export this collective insanity onto other planets, right? So if you're an overarching ET or interdimensional intelligence or an intelligence that's outside of space time altogether, you might go, that's not such a great idea. Like you guys are bottlenecked. You're increasing your capacity to cause damage, inflict damage, and your consciousness is not keeping pace at all, right? And that separation is increasing. So that may be why there's been this uptick, and that maybe this 26, 27 thing may have been about like a kind of reckoning, like
Hmm.
not necessarily an apocalypse, but at least something needs to change. Like the status quo cannot continue, right?
Hmm.
Now, I think that John Ramirez, that ex CIA analyst, has said that it's not so much about a cataclysm, I don't think, so much as some sort of major reveal of some sort. So maybe that's when the ETs or the interdimensionals or whatever you want to call them show up. Like
Hmm.
people look up and the sky is full of craft or something like that, or they do land on the White House lawn, and also in Moscow and different places, Tehran and whatnot. Maybe so, but it's kind of unclear. But there's some sense that something's coming, and you hear whisperings both of some sort of major reveal and or some sort of potential coming cataclysm, right? So when we look even at the work of someone like Graham Hancock, right, who's
Hmm.
suggested he sees evidence for previous kind of cataclysms, and it might be a cyclical kind of thing, right, that
Right.
comes around every 10 or 12,000 years. Now, some people think immediately, oh, that's some sort of cosmic event that's just a recycling part of the physical universe. Maybe something comes too close to Earth orbit and causes magnetic shifts or whatever. But there's also this notion, if there is this overarching intelligence that's kind of controlling our development, then they may be the ones that have set up that kind of system, so that there comes this time where there's this kind of reckoning. Can this group move forward, or do we need to reset again, right? So speaking of, again, religious history, things like the global flood, right, these things like
Hmm.
this, um, is that, I mean, when I was studying this, we were sort of taught, that this is it's metaphoric, right? This is, you don't take it seriously. This kind of thing can't happen. These people were pre-scientific, so maybe it was like a regional flood, like Lake Superior or something, right? Not the globe. They had no notion of a globe, right, at that
Hmm.
point. All these things are true, but maybe we shouldn't leap so quickly to that conclusion. Maybe there is evidence, even in the fossil record and the geological record, for massive floods. And when you think about how much of the planet is actually filled with water, just like when you think about a tank, and if you tip it up quickly, I mean, that's a very unstable situation. So if we had a massive, tectonic shift or magnetic shift, you could have, unheard of size tsunamis kind of wiping over the planet, kind of thing, over the landmass, which is the minority of the planet, right? So certainly possible that many, many things we know scientifically, many, many things could be cataclysmic for us. And what's interesting is when we look back at history, it may be that this has happened before, and that maybe even based on the timeline and based on all this perfect storm of things arising, AI, our warlike nature, how we're still so divisive, how we do all of that while at the same time still not really growing our consciousness, not acting like a single body trying to do the best for all, that maybe some sort of reckoning might be coming. That's one of the possibilities.
Right. And there's, a lot of people that are aware and point to all these different things, like the Mayans and the calendar ending in
Right.
2012 and Hopi prophecy, and then they're aware and tracking like solar flares, like sun flares that are seemingly that seem to be increasing, and even the magnetic poles that are shifting faster than they have before, that might be pointing to some of the things you're talking about as well.
Absolutely. That's the thing, right? Like when you actually start paying attention to this stuff, right? You realize, like I remember that meteor that came and hit Russia, when was that, 10 years ago or something? we didn't see it till the last minute, because it turns out that if
Hmm.
something comes, like, I think from like around the sun or something, because of the brightness of the sun and the glare, we often don't notice until it's like a day or two away, right? So we are much more vulnerable than I think most people think, right? So something could literally, and I think even now we're only beginning to put technology in place to try to think about how could we deflect some of these things. But even then, that's assuming you see them coming in plenty of time, right? And that's just assuming only some sort of cosmic body coming, right, causing the problem. Like you say, if it's a magnetic shift that just happens suddenly, some tectonic shift, then in geology and even in archaeology and anthropology, you kind of have this sense of incrementalism, this idea that things have rolled out in exactly the same way, pretty much in a very predictable manner, and that's why we went from zero to where we are today as a civilization. There was nobody before us here, but a lot of those are assumptions, right? Because we're getting into prehistory where we don't know what happened before, right? So again, we're looking at hubris, I would suggest again. Um, and sometimes it just seems like almost like wishful thinking. Like we don't really have a lot of evidence to say that we are that stable or that safe, and that maybe it's just wanting to believe we are that kind of puts that forward as kind of the dominant narrative. But I think people like Hancock are making the point that there are innumerable things that could wipe us out or cause major distress, that are purely physiological, or purely physical events that happen that we know about, like you say, solar flares, right? We're an increasingly technological electronic society.
Hmm.
You have one massive eruption of plasma from the sun, it's like a massive EMP pulse, wipes out our infrastructure, right? And so then suddenly people, can't get groceries, and they can't get gas, and they
Hmm.
can't, like, you call their friend on their digital network, right? And then we saw what happened with COVID, with people like doing a run on toilet paper, right?
Right.
Just imagine what would happen if this was going on, right?
Hmm.
Which again, I think speaks to our level of consciousness too, which is a major problem. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to get to how it seems that the ones that the ETs that are trying to help us are trying to give us this perspective, this growth in consciousness, that we are all connected and that we are all one, and that we need to start thinking more. One thing I think that just the recognition of ETs is that, hey, we're not, it's kind of going back to like when we thought the Earth was the center of the universe, of the solar system, and we realize we're not, and there's a lot bigger things going on. This is like another perspective shift. Things are a lot bigger than us, but at the same time, we are all connected, and that I guess some people talk about that, ETs. That maybe they seeded us, and that they're part of our bloodline, and so they're also connected to us, and that yes, we just need to think about our globally and less tribally, and what can we do to come together and figure things out.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, what's interesting about that is that notion that you hear a lot of from some of these others, and even some of the, channel material that's been gathered supposedly, about, registering dialogues between human beings and other kinds of entities, ETs or interdimensionals, whatever you want to call them. um, there is that notion that we are all sort of extension, like fractal extensions of source, right? That we
Hmm.
all ultimately are like leaves on the same tree, kind of thing. And that, our biggest problem as a human collective is that we believe in the illusion of separation, that we think that we are these individual units that are distinct from everything else, a little bit like a cancer cell, right? Like, what does a
Hmm.
cancer cell do? It worries about its own self, regardless of the fact that it's actually an integral part of a body, and it could actually do things that end up destroying the entire body, right? So they're trying to remind us of this fact that we are all connected. And when you recognize that, you just by nature shift your perspective. What becomes a selfish move, if you identify as everything and everyone, is
Hmm.
you automatically start acting in the best interest of the whole, right? The
Right.
collective. And as much as people sometimes say, oh, they have this kind of Star Trek mentality of what if they're like the Borg, right? And it's like a hive mind, like bees, and that's kind of where our fear states go.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, how much different would the world be if we actually inherently made decisions based on what's in the best interest of us and the animals and the earth itself, right? I mean, it would be completely different. And all these concerns about AI would not be a problem, right? If we had that perspective, because we would, because the thing is with AI, we seed it with our biases, right?
Right. Right.
So if we had different
Algorithm.
biases, yeah, with the best interest in mind, again, it could be a great tool. But not only are the others, the ETs, I call them the others more than the ETs, just because
Hmm.
again, there's the question of what are they ultimately,
Right.
and if space time is not what we think it is, then these notions are probably too limiting. So I use others just because it's kind of generic.
Hmm.
It kind of works across the board. But not only do we have them, reportedly telling us these kind of messages, but again, ancient non-dual traditions have been saying this all along, right?
Hmm.
That we are all fractal impressions of source, and that we're all connected, and that duality is an illusion. When we act as individuals, we're believing in a separation that's ultimately illusory, right? So whenever you act based on things that are not true, you're going to have bad results in the long run, and that's
Right.
basically the message. But again, not only from these ETs, but also from these ancient non-dual traditions, and also the findings of quantum mechanics seem to be pointing in that direction. That even things that manifest as objects and items, right? Even at the quantum level, that below that it's basically just a field of energy that has excitations that take the semblance of a manifestation of something physical, right? But this table that I'm knocking on is mostly empty space, right? And we know that now, right? So it just we're being confronted now with recognition that the way the world is put together is not as we perceive it, right? It's really not as we perceive it. So it's mostly a coherent field around this table that gives it the impression of being solid and separate, right? But when you really look at the quantum level, these distinctions are kind of arbitrary, right? It works for us in our kind of, again based on our perception that evolution has served up for us. But at the most fundamental level, you just have a field, right, that has different excitations. So that also speaks to this notion that everything is connected. And like we said, if it's true that consciousness actually is foundational, it's the bedrock from which we get things like what we perceive as a physical world, then ultimately we're all connected. We're all the same thing. So that makes sense, not only from ancient spiritual traditions, not just from what the others seem to be telling us, but also what quantum mechanics seems to be pointing towards as well.
Yeah, man, that's great. I agree 100%, and that's what this podcast is all about. Um, I think going back to talking about the reckoning and maybe some sort of catastrophe happening or some sort of collapse. I kind of referencing Carl Jung, we need to expose the shadow to then deal with it. And so I think right now is that kind of time of, um, you know, exposing the shadow, exposing the corruption and the evil and all the systems that are no longer working as well, and that we need to get past. And you know, it's going to be hard to, we see politicians, we see the right, the left switch back and forth. But it's like, are things really changing? Is there really that much difference? And I would say no. And so obviously it's going to be tough and it's going to be hard. But I see it kind of is exciting because how else are we going to get to something better if there's not some sort of collapse and us needing to figure out something better.
Yeah, I love that, and I love the Carl Jung piece, because I think he was onto something, right? I mean, even if maybe the ultimate conception isn't quite what he pictured, he was
Right.
moving us, I think, closer to something, right? And so there's when you read Carl Jung's works, obviously he said a lot of things, and you see kind of an evolution in some of his thinking, to the point where he eventually got to a point where he almost seemed to be saying, I think there's a couple places where he says this outright, basically, that physical reality is the other side of the coin of the collective unconscious.
Hmm.
So physical reality is the manifestation of the machinations of consciousness, basically,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, then you look at it like, when we live in such a way that we don't deal with even our own personal traumas, our own personal shadow, and then you get that multiplied, right? In terms of you get whole culture groups that have not dealt with it, right? Things in our past that still are there. I mean, this is the thing. If this is all kind of energy in the end, you could think about it that way. Then if you don't deal with it, what I like to say to people, both to individuals and to collectives, it's like an app running on your phone in the background that's using up energy, right? Like it's spiraling in the background. You'd never shut down the app because if you have some sort of trauma, both as an individual or as a collective, that you've never actually dealt with, transmuted, then that energy is just like wrapped up in that app and it's
Hmm.
actually taken away from the core capacity of the phone. And the analogy there is to us, right? That we are not, it's not only that we have trauma that's not been dealt with, but we can't, I know your podcast, becoming who we can't fully become who we are when part of us is wrapped up in not even really processing trauma, but just like cycling it, right?
Hmm.
And then you take that to a collective level. So one of the spiritual teachers that really influenced me was a guy named Thomas Ubel from Austria, and he spent years now working with Europeans, Germanic kind of Europeans and Israelis dealing with the trauma of the Holocaust, right? And not
Mm.
just acknowledging it historically, but actually working through and beginning to transmute the energy, that huge shadow that hangs over Europe still today, right? Energetically. So, so absolutely, these are things we need to do, and I think that the UFO phenomenon and these messages coming through again, even when they don't try to land on the White House lawn, what I think is part of the hope is that these messages that bubble up about the things we need to pay attention to will eventually capture enough of our attention that we begin to work through some of the personal
Mhm.
and collective shadow you're talking about, because only doing that will allow us to act in our full capacity and will allow us to see ourselves and the world differently.
Right. That's great. And kind of going back to what you're talking about, the AI is just a tool that it reflects us, and that's what I love about religion and spirituality is realizing that we can't just change the system because our hearts have to change as well, our own traumas, our own issues, and so we have to go within again, that oneness, and change our consciousness, change our perspective, change, and heal. And so only when we do that are we able to then change the collective, and that be a change that has the foundation and the roots, that will last and have a great effect, or it'll just become corrupted, just like the previous system.
Absolutely. And this is where, I know some people land really, really hard on the left or the right politically. I tend to be like a meta modern. So I sort of like, try to transcend the current kind of
Right.
partisanship.
Hmm.
But one of the things I would say is that so sometimes the left leans heavily on um, there being systemic problems, right, that we need
Right.
to adjust, right? If we can just change the way government is run, then we'll solve the problems. Then you get on the right, this sort of focus on individual responsibility. If people would just, pull themselves up by their bootstraps and deal with their stuff, then they
Hmm.
could empower themselves. There's some truth in both of those things, and an in
Hmm.
between of like culture groups that support us as individuals, right, and families and communities, right. So really, a sort of again, I have an integral background too, where we like to say the goal is to transcend and include, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
not transcend and reject, right? But transcend and include. Because when you do transcend and reject, you cause shadow. When
Hmm.
you just say, I don't like this part of you, I'm going to just pretend it doesn't exist, or I'm going to shame it into non-existence, that does not work, right? So I think this is one of the challenges our society is going through right now, is that when we try to increase justice, sometimes just shaming the bad
Hmm. Hmm.
doesn't actually deal with it. You have to transmute that energy, right? You have to
Right.
actually change it into something else. Otherwise, it just gets shoved down. It's like that cycling app again, right? That'll eventually raise up in a not very nice way, right? Um, so yeah, absolutely, we have to keep all in this mind.
Yeah, no, that's great. I totally agree. I'm right there with you. I don't know if you were specifically referencing spiral dynamics, but I love that, and
Mhm.
I plan to have an episode talking about all that. But it's all very connected to what we're all saying here.
Yeah, and I would say that spiral dynamics has really informed my perspective, not just of human history, but also of what the others are likely working with as well.
Mm,
Because I do think there's all sorts of evidence that everything ultimately is one, that ultimately there is, one source, and we all are extensions, like fractal impressions of that. Then I think the same, even though you're going to get some cultural differences and some species specific differences, just like we get on the Earth, nevertheless, there's these underlying core principles, right? So one of the things that's so fascinating about spiral dynamics is that you have this predictable sort of trajectory for consciousness development, right? that you mentioned tribalism several times, right?
Mhm.
So over time, we can see as much as people can turn on the news today and things look really gloomy, and in many ways they are. But at the same time, over time, you can see that our notion of like the sphere of care and concern around us has been expanding, right? So at first, it's just my family, then it's my tribe, then it's my nation state, then it's my religious group, then it's like my race, and then it's like eventually, actually, we need to make room for everybody. And then
Mhm.
now we get more recently, we need to take care of the animals. They're sentient beings, right? And the goal is to kind of have like a cosmocentric perspective eventually, where you expand that throughout the cosmos, right? So, um, but what that spiral dynamics points towards is that there's this directionality, the teleos, right, behind the entire existence, right, behind the cosmos, which says to me that these most advanced ones would not only be technologically more advanced, but they would actually be closer to the heart of source, if you will.
Mm.
And so we tend to we see this directionality already in human development, and I think you can actually apply that across the board. Even though, again, you're going to get some differences and whatnot, and it's very complex, but that does inform my overall perspective of like where some of these are coming from in terms of their moral imperatives.
Right, I totally agree. I will say that some people might shoot back, and I would agree to a certain extent that just because we're advancing technologically, like some of these others have it, but they are still very dark, and
Right.
some spirituals say service to self. Um, but it
Right.
does seem that the more you advance, the more that takes. We can see that in our own society, cooperation and collaboration, and this unity, this oneness, and that eventually, if you don't have that, it's going to collapse. And so it's like they
Right.
can only advance so far in this
Right.
technological way before it collapses.
Right. And when you said service to self, were you referencing the raw material there?
Um, I don't. I guess that originates there. I'm not for sure, but
Right. Because the reason I bring that up is because if you remember, what's interesting about that is exactly what you're saying. You can keep progressing technologically for a waves, even beyond
mhm,
sort of the 3D construct we
right.
have. But if you remember in that channel material, you actually get to some point where there's a roadblock and you cannot go any further in development unless you choose to align with source
hmm
and align with the perspective of service to others, right? And
Right.
service to the all kind of thing. So yes, I absolutely believe that's true. And that's why I say when some light, love and light people, I think, make that mistake, they sort of go, well, if they're technologically more advanced, they must be more morally
hmm
advanced. And I don't think that's a one for one truth,
Right.
right? And one of the things that people like Ken Wilber and Integral taught me is that there's different lines of intelligence, right? And you can proceed in one and actually be fairly, developmentally challenged in another, right? So
hmm
someone might have a great aesthetic intelligence or mathematical intelligence or interpersonal intelligence, right? But you look back even our own history, some of the most sophisticated technology was the Nazis, right? And would we call that like the epitome of moral, advancement? No, right?
hmm
So we see already evidence that those sometimes you get an outpacing that happens where one is ahead of the other. But like you kind of hinted at, I think in the long run though, when you get really at the higher levels, it becomes increasingly difficult to keep progressing without that kind of um, understanding of the resonance of the whole. And I think there's even in our own society, there's this some sort of statistic someone found one time that any two countries that like had a McDonald's, I mean that maybe that's changed now, but there was a while there where any two countries that had a McDonald's had never gone to war, right? In other words, there's something about once you have this interconnected kind of even like market-based system, it really
hmm
changes the calculus. So I think
Right.
that happens on a big cosmic level ultimately.
Right. I was really interested in, obviously it's a tragedy of the Russia-Ukraine war, but I was really interested in how countries were trying to economically punish Russia, and I was like, is that going to work? Is that a new way of warfare where we don't actually have to kill each other? And so, I don't know if that seems to not be so effective because some countries are like, hey, we'll still give you stuff, but it was really interesting experiment.
No, it's true, and then the argument there is that Putin like spent a long time, maybe even years, undergirding the economy and storing up, gold and money so that reserves so that it could like withhold the attack of an attack on its economy, right?
Hmm.
But there's something to what you're saying for sure.
Hmm. Yeah. Oh man, this has been great. It's been amazing. Is there anything you'd like to add at the end?
Just that I think, one thing I do like to point out to people is that I do think, for many, many reasons, it's clear that we are kind of at a key inflection point as a civilization, and do need to wake up. Now, whether you
Mhm.
say that that's some group of others that's making you aware of that notion, or you're just looking outside or watching the news, and it's becoming very clear to you that we are at a point of no return, perhaps, and we really need to like fundamentally rethink how we exist together and on the planet. I think we're absolutely at that point, and I think all of this work that I do, that's my main concern. Actually, is like how can we use all of these different inputs to really inspire our imagination to think about how to do things differently, and not just tweaking the system, but fundamentally changing how we show up. Because I think that's actually what's necessary, and all the evidence of that is all around us.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's great. Um, so Darren, obviously, again, he has his own podcast. This is just a little condensed taste. I really appreciate how in depth and thorough and logical he presents everything, goes into everything. And so I'll reference that in the show notes. Um, and yeah, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed it.
I did too, Kendall. Great questions and a great conversation all around.
Awesome.